I don't know if everybody's here at the beginning. So my name's Shannon Lane, and I am a political social worker. I am really excited to see you all here. And oh, Jennifer's from Southern too. I love all these Connecticut people. And I work in New York, and I used to live in DC, so I feel like I've got connections, at least geographically, to a lot of you folks. So I'm going to ask Lucy to go ahead and share the PowerPoint, and I want to talk a little bit about what political social work is, and a little bit about what political justice is, which has been the focus of my work for the last couple of years, and then just a couple of thoughts that I have for those of you who are interested in finding new ways of getting involved after you finish today's really inspiring event. Lucy, if you want to go to, well, let me just tell you who's on the slide. On the left is Dorothy Height. If you don't know who Dorothy Height is, you should immediately go look her up. Dorothy Height was amazing. She was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement and one of the few women who had a leadership role in the civil rights movement. And she was a social worker. And the work that she's done to advance civil rights and women's rights in the United States. One of the things that angers me every Women's History Month is that everybody doesn't know who Dorothy Height is, because she was amazing. In the middle is Jeanette Rankin. Jeanette Rankin was the first woman to be elected to Congress in the United States. She was the first woman to be elected to any national legislative body anywhere in the world, and she was a social worker. She got a degree from what is now Columbia, from the New York School of Philanthropy in 1918 or something like that. She actually was elected to Congress before women had the right to vote in most of the United States. And on the right is Alice Paul, who is part of the reason that as a woman, I have the right to vote in the United States. And she was also a social worker. She worked in settlement houses and went to the same school, what is now Columbia, that Jeanette Rankin did, and led the first protests in front of the White House, which now it seems crazy to imagine that, or ridiculous to imagine that there was a time that it wasn't considered appropriate to protest in front of the White House. So, and these are the folks who really, did the work that we're talking about today. So, Lucy, you want to go to the next one? So political social work is, Nicole mentioned that I have so much to say about this that I wrote a book about it with my dear friend Suzanne Pritzker from the University of Houston. And my perspective is that political social work is something that every social worker can do, because it's social work practice that explicitly looks at power dynamics in policymaking and political mechanisms for eliciting social change. And I'll talk about the 5 domains in a little bit, but I just wanted to say that, at the beginning, Sarah was talking about, the benefits of direct practice versus macro practice. I think that sometimes as a profession, we've created this false dichotomy, this fake boundary between micro practice and macro practice. Every time I walk into a meeting with a legislator or I run a board meeting, I am using all of my social work direct practice skills. And every person that a clinician or a direct practitioner interacts with is being affected by our political and our policy system. And so I think sometimes we assume that we have to pick one or the other. Sometimes our schools make us pick one or the other. My school is one of those. At Wurzweiler, you can be a clinical major, a group work major, or a community practice major. And so often our schools sort of enforce these boundaries between them. But my argument is social work skills are social work skills, and you will use them whatever level of practice you're practicing in and whatever field of practice that you're practicing in. So my argument is that every social worker needs to be a political social worker. You want to go to the next one, Lucy? So Suzanne and I sort of divided up political social work domains into 5 different areas, some of which are really, will really feel macro, and some of which, again, every social worker can do. So engaging individuals and communities in the political process, that could be as simple as helping people register to vote, helping people to meet with elected officials and talk about what's happening with them. So the hearing that Tanisha and I testified at on Monday, there were folks in the room who themselves were formerly incarcerated, and they talked about their experiences of being in the criminal justice system and not having access to the right to vote, and helping folks to share their own stories or telling their stories if they're not in a place that they can tell them is a really important role that direct practitioners can take on. Political social work also includes influencing policy agendas. So, what we traditionally think of as advocacy would fit into this area, whether that's case advocacy on behalf of an individual or cause advocacy on behalf of a whole group of people. Holding professional and political positions. So there are some great social work jobs in elected officials' offices, and that some of that is on legislative side. Some of that is doing what we call constituent casework, which is not what social workers call casework, but really helping individual constituents who have concerns or problems with government agencies. There's a whole plethora of roles for social workers. I have a friend who's a MSW who works for the auditor's office in Connecticut and makes sure that programs are running in the way that they're supposed to be done. There are just a huge number of ways social workers can work in political positions or in those kinds of professional positions. The challenge is for those of you who are going to be looking for a job, like August, looking for a job in a couple months. You can't just search social worker to find those jobs, right? So they're jobs that are very well suited to social workers. Sometimes they just take a little bit of time to find. Engaging with electoral campaigns. My friend Tanya Rhodes Smith is in another breakout room right now talking about how social workers can work on political campaigns. There's so many good roles for social workers on campaigns, knocking on doors, making phone calls, helping to organize volunteers. I think social workers are great volunteer coordinators because we know how to get people to show up. We remember to thank them and treat them kindly when they're there. And running for office. So, I know that during the keynote today, Professor Hodge from the University of Michigan, go blue, mentioned that he has had really big impacts working in local office and serving on the Washtenaw County Commission. And I think local office is a great place for social workers to think about getting involved. I ran for school board in my town 2 years ago. I didn't win by 47 votes, which was not fun. But I learned a tremendous amount through the campaign, and I've had the opportunity to get involved in so many things in my community now. I'm a parent. I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, and because I ran for school board, when I have conversations with the school superintendent and the principal and the folks on the school board and the other people in our community who are doing equity work and anti-racist work, right? I have a different perspective on that and a different sort of level of people knowing me in the community than I did before. So these are some of the ways that social workers can get involved in political social work. Lucy, do you want to go to the next one? One thing I really wanted to talk about today is something that's relatively new in the social work discussion of these issues, and that is the idea of political justice. Often as social workers, if we think about the political system, we think about advocating or we think about helping people to vote. And those are both really important. But I think it's really part of our challenge is to stay true to the core of who we are as social workers. And for me, political justice is a key part of that. So political justice is the ideal situation that we are always working towards, in which all members of our society have equal access, yes, to voting rights, but also to all of the other mechanisms by which they can be part of the political process, right? Whether that's testifying in front of the Connecticut General Assembly, whether that's having good representation, and not living in gerrymandered districts where they're not really given access to good political representation, and running for office themselves. Over the last, I would say, decade, I've seen a lot of wonderful changes in who's running for office and who's winning. We now have Maxwell Frost in the US Congress, so the first member of that generation in Congress. Here in Connecticut, we just elected our 8th social worker to the state legislature, which is a record for us. Some of whom I've been fortunate enough to have in my classrooms, which is amazing. We need a different group of people representing us if we want to have different results come out of our policy process. But having access to run for office, right, that's a political justice issue because it's time consuming. Some places you have to pony up some money to run. There's a lot of things that make that process inequitable. Democracy as an ideal, as a political philosophy, relies on inclusive participation, which has never existed in the US, right? If we go back 200 plus years to the founding of the United States, when only white men over the age of 25 who owned property were allowed to vote, we have increased our suffrage, right? We've increased who gets to vote over and over and over through the years. And every time we increase it, there's a pushback, right? So you think about, the Civil War, the 15th Amendment, where Black men were allowed the right to vote. Immediately, you started to see states put Jim Crow laws and literacy tests and poll taxes into effect, right? So you go to 1965 and we passed the Voting Rights Act, and we, ideally open up voting to a whole new swath of people. And then you start to see pushback on that, where even over the last decade, we've seen the Supreme Court and state legislatures erase a lot of that progress towards access to the right to vote. So it's the ideal that we're moving towards, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I think you probably already know this, but I think it's important to say that political injustice, like most forms of social injustice, disproportionately harms the people who are considered to have their voices less worthy in our society, right? By the people who are in power. So folks who are Black, folks who are Latino or Latina, folks who live in poverty, people with health challenges, physical or mental, disabilities. Folks with disabilities vote at a much lower rate than other folks, even though technically our laws protect their rights to vote. And as we were just talking about, people with criminal justice involvement. Two states, Maine and Vermont, the two of the whitest states in the country, just, pointing that out, allow people to vote at any point during their incarceration. Every other state in the country disenfranchises people either while they are incarcerated, while they're on parole, while they're on probation, or in some states, fewer states, but still some people are banned from voting for the rest of their lives if they have a felony conviction. And that's a problem because our criminal justice system disproportionately affects communities of color. And so if our voting rights are contingent on your criminal justice involvement, then that system is going to continue to disproportionately disenfranchise folks in communities of color. So there's a lot of opportunities in political social work to advance racial justice and social change and work towards political justice. Lucy, do you want to go to the next one? I cannot talk about political justice or voting in any speech that I give without quoting two of our pioneers in this area, right? So former Congressman John Lewis, who was, not just an incredible leader for voting rights, but an incredible leader for civil rights. I realized the other day that Bloody Sunday was 58 years ago this week, which is just a really remarkable thing that we've been fighting for voting rights and civil rights in this country for so long that landmark is 50 years in the rearview mirror, and we're still fighting for it. So John Lewis said, "Your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have to create a more perfect union." And voting activist Stacey Abrams says, "We need active and relentless participation in our elections and government." And these quotes, I think, are so important to how we are thinking about political justice and political social work and voting rights, because protecting people's right to vote and participate in the system is so important in terms of moving our society forward. But it also does take active and relentless participation, right? We are working against systems that don't want to be changed. Systems that are often populated by people who are perfectly happy with the status quo because it's worked for them. And so this idea of a relentless participation and continuing to move forward is really, really important. All right, next slide. Okay, so I am hoping that we'll have some time today to answer any questions you have. But one of the most common questions that I get is, what can I do? Right? What are the things that I can do? And for me, this all comes down to finding your people. So the next slide, Lucy, is the first example of this. I teach at Worcester School of Social Work, but I have the honor to be involved with the Humphreys Institute at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. And the Humphreys Institute is designed to increase the political participation and power of all social workers and the communities that they serve. If you have never heard of the Political Institute, go check them out. We just ran an amazing 2-day long campaign school where we trained 150 social workers from across the country and Germany of how to run for office. And the Humphreys Institute also powers a lot of the voting is social work stuff that you see around. Oh, Jennifer, that's awesome. Yes, the campaign school is amazing. It's a wonderful opportunity. And if you ever have a chance, I definitely recommend attending. The next slide, I think, is about voting as social work. Yes. So, voting as social work, which the Humphreys Institute partners with, is a national group of social workers, practitioners, educators, trying to make sure that all social workers interact with our clients and our communities and help them to vote. It's 2023. A lot of people aren't thinking about voting right now because it's not a presidential year. This is a great time to be thinking about voting because the way that people vote in local elections has such a huge impact on their communities. Where I live, in most places, the odd years are local elections, and that's where we decide things like school board and who's going to run your elections, and your police commission, the things that really affect day-to-day life. And so voting as social work is a phenomenal resource, and I highly recommend you check it out. Next one, Lucy. Another thing you might be interested in, I know there are some folks on the planning committee who are from St. Louis. So if you're at all near St. Louis or you're interested in checking out beautiful St. Louis, we are hosting our second Macro United conference at the beginning of June, which brings together social workers who are community organizers and policy practitioners and administrators and all sorts of practitioners who want to get more involved in macro social work for a really fun 3-day long event with lots of presentations. Lots of students are presenting, and practitioners and educators. It's a lot of fun. For those of you who are doctoral students, there's also a teaching institute on the first day that is really designed to help folks teach policy classes and macro level classes better. So I highly recommend that. Plus, it's just 150 really cool macro people who are fun to talk to. And the next one is this is really the takeaway for me. I think it can be exhausting to do this work. It can be really challenging to continue to fight systems that don't want to be fought. And so one thing that I recommend to everybody is to think about, what is your purpose? So these two cute little babies here are now 7 and 9. I don't have their permission to use more recent pictures. Plus, the baby pictures are they're always fun for me, and hopefully they're fun for you as well. On the left is with the blonde hair is my daughter Kathleen, and on the right with the brown hair is my daughter Caroline. These pictures are taken at events that I took them to, campaign events that I took them to when they were babies, and I continue to take them to over the years. On the left, the woman in blue with the red hair is a former student of mine who was running for state legislature. And on the right is a woman who's now a state senator here in Connecticut. I think it's really important that when you make a decision to get more involved in your community, you have a real strong sense of what your objective is. And I make all of my decisions about political involvement in terms of what is going to help my kids' generation to be better. And if I can't come up with the answer to that, then usually I say no to it. And if I can come up with an answer to that, then I say yes to it, because that's my purpose, right? I feel like my job is to leave them and their generation with the best possible systems that I can. But it also really helps me to say no and take some time to take care of myself and not say yes to everything that's out there, because I could, right? I could go to meetings and webinars and protests and events every night of the week. And that's not good at least it's not good for me. So I think the only thing, Lucy, that's left is my contact information, which I will also put in the chat as well. But I wanted to make sure that we had a chance for people to, either share your own experiences. I'm trying to talk and type my email address at the same time, which is challenging. And I am terrible at doing this, but it's actually harder to do this part than it is to run for office. But I wrote 2 books. And Nicole mentioned one of them earlier, the political social work book. And I also wrote a book that some of you might end up using in your policy class, which is called Social Welfare Policy in a Changing World. And my publishers would like it if I mentioned them more often than I do, but I'm super awkward about it. So there you go. So Lucy, if you want, you can take that down so that we can see each other. I put my contact info in the chat, and I'd really like to hear from folks and see what questions you have about political social work for me or for each other. Is the macro conference virtual in person? It is in person this year. It was virtual 2 years ago. It's going to be in person this year, Leanne. And but one of the things you can do is you can get on the mailing list for the group that is sort of hosting it, which is called Influencing Social Policy. In addition to the macro conference, they do a bunch of virtual events throughout the course of the year. And so if getting yourself to St. Louis is a big ask, especially in June. Like I have a group of students who are graduating in May, and they'd like to come to the conference, but they're really not sure what they're doing for a living come June 1st, and so planning for that is a little bit stressful. So if you go to the Influencing Social Policy website and get on their mailing list, you can sort of find out about other opportunities to get involved with them and their virtual events as well. Jamie, thank you for telling me that you used the textbook. I said at the beginning, it's just I will never get used to people having read things that I wrote and paid money for them. And also, the publishing industry is a racket, and I apologize for the price of them. If I could do them for free, I would, but I don't have any control over that at all. So, questions about political social work, about any of the things we've talked about so far? Yes, Tanisha.
Good job.
Is that Tanisha? Am I saying it right?
It's Tanisha. Just
Tanisha,
ignore
okay.
the second I and
Ignore the okay.
most
Gotcha.
of the rest of the spelling of it as well. It's nice to see you again. I guess my question is, you were talking a little bit about work, like finding work and how it's a little bit different looking for work as a macro social worker. And I'm graduating in May, so I guess there's a couple like macro social work job boards that I follow and I kind of get emails for. Not a ton of like openings get sent. So suggestions on like job searching, like
Yeah.
the job boards are like there's different, like a couple macro social workers that will send out like alerts to each other, and it's like a network of people that they send alerts
We are
to.
lucky in Connecticut because we have a pretty robust macro social work network in Connecticut. And so that's, I think, probably that's the one that I think of first. So maybe Tanisha, that's the one that you're thinking about as well.
I think the one I get, I think, is from Alberto Cifuentes.
Alberto Cifuentes. Yep. Yeah. So it is a little bit different. It's actually like this is not trying to sell you the book, but we wrote a whole chapter in the political social work book because that was one of the things that we heard from our students is that if you're looking for a job as a clinician, you go to Indeed, you type in clinical social worker, right?
Yeah.
And things come up. So one of the things that I really recommend is I should also tell you all my children are going to come running through that door in a minute because the bus just left off. So I apologize in advance. Maybe they'll come say hi and you'll get to see what they look like when they're not babies. This is why networks of macro social workers are so important because because I'm from Connecticut and I work in New York, those of you who are local, you're welcome to email me and I'll give you some suggestions about places to look. But my networks are relatively, everything's local. I have found that a lot of students have had really good luck if they had a macro placement, talking with the folks at their placement and getting some suggestions through there. Or even if you've had a more micro placement, often the folks that you work with are still, connected to other places. Some of the jobs that I think social workers are just stellar at are working in elected officials' offices, doing, casework, correspondence, especially at the sort of more entry level, social workers can end up doing a little bit of everything. So I actually don't know that I mentioned it, but I worked on Capitol Hill for a decade. I worked for most of it for Senator Tom Daschle, who at the time was the Democratic leader of the Senate. And I literally got that job by wandering in off the street one day because he's from South Dakota and I'm from South Dakota. And I struck up I walked in and was like, hey, I'm from South Dakota. And struck up a conversation and ended up getting asked to do an internship. And that turned into a job. Um, I think that often when you hear people talk about looking for jobs, they talk about networking. And it sounds like I'm saying it's just all about who you know. And that's really not what I mean. I was like, I didn't know anybody. I wasn't connected to anybody. I like wasn't even 100% sure that I was a Democrat until I was 18. Like I was not coming from some sort of political, elite place. Um, and do you want to say hi? Okay.
I don't
Sorry,
know
y'all.
if it's frozen on other people's screens, but your video is frozen on my screen. Is it just me?
Oh,
Okay, it's just me.
it's just you? Okay. Sorry about that. Um, so when I say networking, I don't mean like, oh, go talk to like your parents' friends, right? I mean like find other social workers and um and talk to those folks. Um, so talking with your internship supervisors, talking with your professors, and getting them to connect you to their networks, I think is really important. Talking with other students and alums of your program is really important. And then also, like when I have students that I'm helping look for jobs, I'm looking for stuff that has like program director in the title, right? That's often a really good. Ooh, Leanne, that's a great recommendation. Um, it sounds like she's got a good booklet. But I think the last chapter of the book, one of the things that we talk about is sort of where to look for the jobs. The other thing that we talk about is that you've got to be able to create a resume that explains to folks how you being a social worker is useful to them. Um, because I remember going for a job interview once on the Hill, and the chief of staff that I was meeting with, who I knew, looked at my resume and said, "Oh, I didn't realize you were a social worker. Are you interviewing for a casework job?" And I was like, "Dude, you have known me for 5 years. You know that that's not why I'm here." But there are people who will think social work and they have a super narrow idea of what that is. So you've got to be able to, Leanne, you are very popular now in the chat. This is just a really good way to make friends, is tell people you've got a great resource for them.
I know. I'm sorry to butt in on
No, no,
you.
no, no, this is great. But I do think it's really helpful to think about you've got to be able to tell your story, and you've got to be able to talk about the experience that you have and the skills that you bring to the table, and assume that the person on the other end of the table, if they're not a social worker, they might not know that this is a job that social workers can do. So you might need to sort of do more explaining to that. So like I work a lot with my students to like de-jargon your resume, so that as social workers, right? Like you might have something in there about competencies, or you might have, of course, I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, right? But we talk in jargon all the time. And so basically, like your resume needs to read so that like if my dad picked it up, he would understand what it says, right? Not like somebody who's been in social work for 20 years. So find a friend who doesn't know anything about social work and have them look at your resume and make sure that it makes sense to them as well. All right, so Leanne says just email her because she's starting to lose track. I don't know either. I don't know. Oh no, it's on the entertainment center.
it it was something that I received from my professor because I've asked that question too because I'm like I don't want to do micro work, and so she found this and sent it to me, and it talks about human resources and communications,
Hmm.
of course policy and nonprofit and that kind of stuff, and it just really helped me to figure out how my skills translate into macro. And I think it kind of goes along with what you were
Hmm.
saying too, is that everybody just assumes that social work's micro and therapy and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah,
but it's so important to be on the micro level,
yeah.
macro level.
And I will say that so when I worked on the Hill, people would say to me like, "How come you decided not to be a social worker anymore?" And some of the people who said that to me were social workers. And man, there's nothing that like makes the top of my head want to blow off like that. Like we as social workers undervalue our field. And so when I go, Tanisha, when I testified on Monday, the first thing I said when I sat down was, "My name is Shannon Lane and I'm a social worker." Right? Like we need to be visibly in the spaces that we want other people to be, because if you don't see it, you can't do it, right? And we need to be able to do that for people.
It's so true too. And it's even true, like, I think for a lot of us, like, I originally was in a clinical focus when I started the MSW program. And then I took my first policy class and I was like, oh, I didn't know this was a thing. And I like
Hmm.
immediately switched my concentration. And I think that's the case for a lot of people.
Hmm.
Like, we're not
Yeah.
even aware of it.
Yeah, it needs to be more visible. I argue with my admissions people at my university all the time because I'm like, if you don't talk about it, people aren't going to come here for it. So, and Nicole, I think that's true, right? We had the Speaker of the House in the Connecticut state government for a long time was a social worker. He would introduce himself as a union organizer, but not as a social worker. So there is some of that we can do as well. Anyway, I could talk about finding jobs forever, but I think that's actually the point of the office hours next as well. So you're going to have more opportunities to do that. Other questions that I can answer today for you all? I don't know what to do, sweetie. I when I'm done with this. Would you like to say hi? Okay, this is the other one. Okay, go. Sorry. Other questions? Sarah?
My question is actually for Nicole. I would like to know more of this social work political boot camp that she speaks of.
Oh, where did she go? Nicole, where are you? I will tell you the two, Sarah, that I know about are that CRISP does a boot camp, which they haven't done for a few years, but I think they're starting up again this year. And then the campaign school that I mentioned at the UConn School of Social Work. Um, so those are the two that I know. Because you've attended today, you will be on CRISP's mailing list, so you will hear about the events that they're doing as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Other questions? Brianna? Oh, I can't hear you. It says you unmuted, but I can't hear you. Mm-mm. Is it just me? Can you guys hear her? Okay, it's not just me. Oh. All right, you'll put it in the chat. Oh, it's so much more fun to hear people's voices. But okay, put it in the chat. Any other questions while Brianna's typing? Um, Leanne, the other thing I wanted to say to go along with, I guess it's Tanisha's question in your booklet, is there's a great article by Suzanne Pritzker, who I wrote the book with, and I'm blanking on her co-author's name. But if you go to Google Scholar and you type Suzanne Pritzker macro practitioners or something like that, they did a whole survey of graduates of their program at the University of Houston who'd gone into macro social work. And one of the things that's really cool about it is that they put together a list of all the position titles that they had. So like to think about like, because, as you said, like you might think about, policy, a legislative position or a policy person, but like a director of development might not have occurred to you, right? And so it's a whole list of potential job titles that you might want to use in your searching. So I highly recommend it. If you can't find it for some reason, just email me after this and I will find it and attach it. There are some great macro social workers on Instagram. I am a big fan of social work. I'm not on Twitter anymore because Elon Musk, but I'm a great fan of like social work Twitter and social work Instagram and social work. I don't do TikTok either because old lady. But there are some really great ideas out there. Um, okay, Brianna's question. Do you have any advice for ways to navigate having very left-leaning politics and working with conservative, constricting environments? Oh boy, do I. We are being recorded. Let me think how I want to answer this question politically. Um, And while I'm answering that, Zahira, I'm not sure I understand your question. So will you elaborate more in the comments? All right, Brianna. Yes. So I think there's really two important things to think about. One is to separate out your politics from the your organization or your community, right? So where I live in a relatively, people think of Connecticut as really progressive. I live in a very moderate town within Connecticut, which means we have people on the far left and people on the far right. So we end up seeming like a moderate town. Um, and a lot of what I think is really valuable for me when I show up in community events is um, to to figure out what is the role I'm going to play in my coalition and what is the role other people are going to play, right? So, like for example, I think, and a lot of this comes back to power and privilege, right? So we had an event in my community a month ago where a person on the school board, one of the school board members, made a comment that was racist towards our superintendent who is Black. And that's, I think, a really good example of like, I've got a lot of white privilege. And so I'm going to step up and talk about it, right? And I'm not going to expect that only I'm not going to expect that it's my friend Keith's job to do that, right? Because he's Black and he's dealing with microaggressions every day. So I think that, Brianna, is a little bit of my answer to your question, is to figure out who's in your coalition in terms of the work that you're doing and figure out sort of what is the role that you can play versus what other people can play. The second thing I'm going to say is you've got to figure out what your objective is, right? If it's to get a specific policy passed, then you might end up having to work with folks who are on the other side of the aisle that are not people that you would normally want to work with or have a ton of respect for. If it is to make sure that an issue is visible, then maybe I don't need to work with folks on the other side of the aisle, right? Maybe I just stick with the other advocates who are in my lane. I have lived in red states and blue states and Washington, D.C., which has basically no political representation. And it is there's still so much work to be done in more liberal environments, like using Connecticut as an example. Like the voting laws in Connecticut are much less progressive than people realize. But it is still easier to do the work here than it is in the red state. I grew up in South Dakota. I spent a long time working in politics in South Dakota, and some of it's brutal, um, and some of it has gotten worse. Um, this is not being as like inspirational as I intended it to be, but it's such an important question, right? I think um, that what I would recommend is I would love to connect you with, I was telling Lucy, like I have a colleague who's a social work professor in Florida, and he is like on the governor's hit list right now, right? And he is getting a lot of flack from folks around them. And so I think there is a lot to be said for figuring out your objective, finding your people, and finding other people who are doing the work to get advice from them in terms of what works for them and how to support them. How to support you. So I hope that answers your question, Brianna. And if not, you can put more in the chat. Zahira says mental health breaks for politicians in terms of like mental health breaks. Okay, I'm still not 100% sure, but I do think that it is. Oh, good. You're gonna ask. Thank you so much, Zahira.
Yeah, so it's a lot easier than typing it. And this has been the difficulty that I've had, right? So I'm a doctoral student, right? And a lot of my research has been developing or scaffolding towards my capstone, which is mental health reprieve for politicians. So, and I'm coming from a place, I reside in Buffalo, New York. We dealt with the mass shooting, here. Also, looking at things that happen, in DC, things of that nature, and the responses from politicians recovering from that trauma. So from that, I was able to begin to look at mental health reprieve or mental health breaks. Our local politicians here do not have that carved out in their position.
So you mean like time off? Is that
time
like,
off? Yeah,
okay.
time off.
Yeah.
So with that, I have not found a lot of research. Actually, there is a gap in research regarding that because politicians have been left out as a discipline, right? Like social workers, teachers, things of that nature. So I'm finding a very difficult time finding research. So I was just questioning whether you had any research on that or knowing where I can begin to kind of dig up information other than relying on other disciplines.
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, is Zahira, am I saying that right? Zahira? Okay, thank you. I think one of the biggest challenges you're going to find is that separate from Congress, because most other political positions are not full-time jobs, right? So like New York and California technically, and Massachusetts and California technically have full-time state legislatures, but everybody else technically has a part-time state legislature. And I think that's part of the problem, right? It's not structured like a job for a lot of people. Um, I don't know of any research in this area, but really my gut reaction to this is thinking about January 6th. As somebody who worked on the Hill for a decade, I had people I loved, including my sister, in the building on January 6th. And I don't think anybody who was there on January 6th has fully recovered from that. But I also worked for Tom Daschle when we opened a letter that had anthrax in it. And I worked on the Hill when 9/11 happened. And I was on the Hill when we had a shooter come into the Capitol building. And I guess I would say my experience is part of being a social worker for me in that environment was every time one of these things happened, I would say, okay, we need to get EAP in here right now. And I remember after anthrax saying like, no, they're going to come talk to everyone. We're not just going to send folks over if they're showing signs. They're going to come talk to everyone. And because my sister was in a leadership position after January 6th, her office, that's the first thing I said to her was call EAP and tell them to come talk to everyone. Right. So I don't know. I think it's the combination, right? I think it's the elected officials and the staff who are really dealing with this trauma right now. Um, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but I think you're right that it's just because it's not, especially like on the elected side, it's not seen as a job that you take time off from. That when you have something like Governor Fetterman in Pennsylvania who needs to take time off to take care of himself, it's seen as a political liability. I'm totally blanking on his name, but there was a candidate in Missouri a few years ago who stepped away from the campaign trail because he needed to take care of his mental health. He was a vet and I'm totally blanking on his name. I'm gonna remember it at 2 a.m. But I think we don't see it. It's not the solution that we are able to offer people in a 40-hour-a-week workplace is so different than the solution here. Anyway, my answer to your question is I don't have the answer, but I agree that it's something that and I guess maybe just for me as Jason Kander, thank you, Leanne. Oh my gosh, that was gonna bug me the rest of the day. I was gonna be at the town meeting tonight thinking about that. Um, but I appreciate that you're doing that. I would say, like, as a staff member who went through a multiple traumatic experiences and then was expected to show up the next day, it was really hard. And I know it was for the members too. My experience in it was as a um, as a staff member. So. I think, Lucy, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we're supposed to end about now. I am happy to stick around and answer questions, but then I'm supposed to go to another room at 4 o'clock to do an office hours. So stick around and ask questions if you have them. Otherwise, it was really great to meet all of you.
Yes, I definitely encourage anyone to exchange contact information. I know a lot of people in this room have already been doing that.
Yes, I will put mine back in the chat too.
Continue doing that. And as Dr. Lane said, at 4, there's office hours. So feel free to hop in and out of people's office hours and just kind of use that as a chance to network and learn about what people have done.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Lucy. Thanks for all your help today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.